This lesson is all about making room for the reader. Cheryl Strayed is one of my favourite memoir writers. She wrote the gorgeous book Wild about her journey walking the Pacific Coast Trail from Mexico to Canada. And she wrote the book Tiny Beautiful Things, which always makes me cry. It's a selection of her advice columns. And I took a workshop with Cheryl, an online workshop, in 2022, and this is what she had to say about a writer's job. She said a writer's job description is to tell the truth about what it means to be human. And when you do, we say, thank you. I see myself in you or in your writing. Now, what Cheryl is talking about there is about the immense courage that it takes to tell your story. It's a really brave thing. It's exciting, and it can also be scary. It means that you have to be ready for other people to have an opinion on your book, which might mean that they have an opinion on your life choices or your life in general. So you've got to be ready for that. And that means it's important to understand your motivations. Why are you writing this book? You've got to know exactly what's in it for you to tell this story and what's in it for the reader, what she's going to learn or take away, or the wisdom that you're going to be able to impart through the story. And we've touched on this a little already in some of the other lessons. So let's have a look at the difference between memoir and autobiography. An autobiography is the story of a whole life from start to finish. It starts at childhood, and it ends at the point that the writer is at that point in time, right? So it might, if you're writing an autobiography when you're 50, it might go from childhood through to 50 or 49, something like that. Or if somebody has passed away, then it would be a biography, would be the full story of their life. Autobiographies are usually written by famous people, telling that story, that full story of their life. And there's interest in the full story of that person's life because of their celebrity, their notoriety, or because of what they've achieved in life. A memoir is something different. It's the story of a slice of a life. It doesn't cover the whole life from the beginning to the end. It covers a specific aspect or a specific part of the journey. So it might be that there's a memoir about the journey to give up alcohol. One that comes to mind is a New Zealand book called Mrs. D is Going Without, and it's by Lotta Dan, and it was her story of how she went from being a functioning heavy drinker through to being happily sober. So it covers that part of her life. It covers her time as a busy working mother, trying to do all the things and coping with stress with a glass or two or three or four of wine at the end of the day. And then it goes through to the time when she was able to really release that and be happily sober. So it's just that chunk of her life. In the same way, you might read a story about a parenting journey that would cover a particular part of the parenting journey. Perhaps the child was suffering from an illness, and it's the story of the family dealing with that illness. If you think about books like Marley and Me, that was a story of a dog, a dog coming into a couple's life and the journey of that dog with the family alongside through that part of their life story. Was the part of their life which Marley the dog was part of the story. Or if you think about travel memoirs, like famous travel writers like Paul Theroux or Bill Bryson, there is really a book that tells all their travel stories. Sometimes you'll get a collection, but usually those writers tell one specific journey in a book. So, for example, Bill Bryson's A Walk in the Woods tells his story of walking the Appalachian Trail in the southern states of the United States. He also wrote another book, I think it's called Notes from a Small Island, which was about his travels around the United Kingdom. So it's that slice that forms the boundaries of that memoir. Now, at some point, Bill Bryson or Paul Theroux might write their autobiography, and that might be the sweeping story of their whole life. But those memoirs are telling specific sections. So what does this mean? A memoir is about you, but it's not about you at all, which is a strange sentence. But what I mean by that is that great memoirs are not purely self-indulgent. or narcissistic. You're not sharing a slice of your life because you think that you're so incredibly interesting to other people. And sometimes people get worried that they're not interesting enough to have a memoir, but that kind of misses the point. A memoir is not this chance to air your grievances, have your say, write about your life because you think it's great. A great memoir makes room for the reader, and that means it's about your life, it's a slice of your life, but it's also about what it means to be human, what Cheryl Strayed was talking about there. There's some wisdom, there's some point, there's some argument, there's some bigger reason why a reader should spend their time reading about you and your life. They're going to learn something, they're going to really care about the story because it speaks to something real and true for them. And this is what we mean by making room for the reader. You're finding that point, that reason that the reader will care about your story so that it becomes not just about the events of your life, but about this bigger truth. So how do you find that? Well, it all comes back to knowing the point of your book. When you're writing a memoir, you've got to choose the story that you're telling. What's the slice of life? Is it something that happened in your childhood? Is it this micro journey to give up alcohol? Is it this particular travel? That story is going to be illustrating a certain point or an argument. And all of the events that are included in the book support that argument or contribute to answering that question. Now, they might seem like big ideas, but don't worry, we're going to go through and look at some examples in a moment. These ideas come in part from my training with Author Accelerator, but also from the book, The Memoir Project by Marion Roach Smith. So I've drawn on those in creating these exercises. So, knowing your argument or the point of your book, this is important because it helps you create the boundaries. It helps you decide what goes in and what stays out. It helps you decide where the story starts and where the story ends. And it helps you determine what events are important to your story. So what you're going to include in the book. There's not going to be an exhaustive list of every interaction you've had. It's not the whole story of your life. It's the events that relate to this argument, this question, this point at the heart of your book. So let's have a look at a few examples. There's some memoirs that I have read over the years, some of them a long time ago. But let's have a look at what the point or the argument or the question might be for each of these books. So The Salt Path, I read this book fairly recently. This is the story of a couple, I believe they're 50 or in their early 50s, and over the course of a couple of days, they essentially lose everything. They lose a legal case, which means that the bank forecloses on their home and they have to leave the farm where they've raised their children within a few days. They have to move out, they have to put what they have in storage, they have to rehome all their animals, and they're reduced to, I think they get a very small sum, something like £45 a week in social benefits, or it might be a fortnight. It's a very small sum of money. They really have nothing. And within, I think, 48 or 72 hours of that happening, the husband is diagnosed with a degenerative neurological condition where he's losing his physical mobility, and it will, in the end, be terminal, I believe. And so they've got nowhere to go, they've got nothing left, and they're sort of losing they're in despair, really, and they decide that they will go and walk the not the Salt Path, I think it's called the Southwest Coast Path, and it starts in North Devon, goes right around the tip of Land's End and all the way around Cornwall, and I think ends in, I want to say Poole, but it might be Plymouth, but anyway, it ends on the south coast of England, so it's an enormous long path. They dig out their old boots and a tent, and they decide that they will walk this trail because they've got nothing else to do and nowhere else to go, and they can't think of anything better to do. So off they go. And it's a story of, I guess, redemption, of healing, of finding hope, of finding their way forward when everything seemed to be lost. And it's told through this journey of walking this Southwest Coast Trail. And so the boundaries of the book are that journey in time, the several months over which they walk this trail, with flashbacks to other parts of their lives where necessary. But mostly it's told in real time as they're walking the path, or as if you're reading it in real time. And so the argument of that book might be, and I'm making this up, I haven't asked the author, Raina Wynn, but the argument might be that when it seems like all is lost, pushing yourself out of your comfort zone or embarking on a big adventure can reset your whole life or rebuild your life, that you can find hope from despair by pushing yourself into a big, bold adventure. That might be the argument, and that sets the boundaries for this book, as well as the time span of walking the salt path. Now, Animal Vegetable Miracle by Barbara Kingsolver. I read this many years ago, but it made a really big impression on me. So I may slightly get the misremember slightly some of the facts, but essentially it's the story of how her family resolved to live for 1 year eating only what they could either grow themselves or they could source within, I believe, a 100-mile radius. So it goes through the passages and seasons of the year, and that's the temporal boundaries of the book, if you like, and it tells the story, but it also then goes into topics of sourcing food, where we get our food from, and then water availability, and the ethics of transporting food long distances, and the ethics of animal husbandry, and all these other things within the boundary of this 1 year in which they committed to only eating what they could grow or source within 100 miles. And so the argument of a book like that might be something like reconnecting with the source of your food will change your life profoundly in ways that you cannot imagine, because by the end of the book the family are transformed from where they were at the beginning, and the way that they live is completely transformed. So the argument would be something around the reconnection, that reconnecting with the source of your food will create all these other shifts in your life. And this is one that was out many years ago now. It was very popular at the time. It's called A Life on Gorge River by Robert Long. It's a New Zealand story, and it is the story of one man's decision to drop out of capitalist society and build his own life in a remote hut in Westland on the southwest coast of New Zealand. It's 2 days walk from what you might call civilization and Haast. He has no electricity, no sewage, no running water. And I think at the point of writing this book, he lived there for about 25, 30 years, living a very unexpected lifestyle. And so he's showing an alternate way of living life. The argument of his book might be around it's actually possible to do this, to drop out of society, to have a rich, rewarding, fulfilling life by going back to pioneering ways, even in modern times. So that might be his argument. I've just made those up. But I hope that shows you how you can find the argument or the point that you're trying to make with the book. It's like the theme. Now, sometimes you won't know, or the theme, or the argument, or the question. Any of those things are interchangeable, really, depending on the topic of your book. Sometimes it won't be obvious until the end. So, for example, Cheryl Strayed, who wrote Wild. So that's her story of it, early in her early 20s, maybe 25. She walked this Pacific Coast Trail from Mexico to Canada. She had very little. At the time, she was recovering from the loss of her mother, and then essentially the loss of her family, because all her siblings had dissipated, and she was really on her own. She'd also left her marriage. She had been dabbling in serious drugs, and really she embarked on this walk to reset her life, I guess. And at the time, what's interesting is that she says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but she says when she started to write the book that she thought she was just writing about that journey toward the Pacific Coast Trail. So there were temporal boundaries, start and finish, geographical boundaries, and all the things that happened along the way. But when she finished the book, she could see that what she had really been writing about was how we go on when we have to carry the unbearable. Like, how did she go on without her mother was the essential question she was answering in that book. She didn't know it at the time. She writes in the opening scenes about her backpack, which had all the hiking paraphernalia that she'd spent what little money she had on buying, water purifiers and tent and sleeping bag and other bits that she didn't really need. And when she put on her backpack the first day to walk this enormous trail, she'd never done anything like that in her life. It was so heavy she fell on her back like a turtle, like she couldn't actually carry this damn thing. And the backpack becomes almost a character in the book, where she's talking about it as she calls it monster, I think. And so we have that theme running through the story, and it's only at the end that she could see that really the backpack monster was a metaphor for the burden that she had to carry of her grief and loss. So though she's writing the book, how do I go on carrying this thing that I can't carry? In the end, she saw that there was a deeper meaning to that. How do I carry this loss, this burden? So it may reveal itself later, and that's okay. You'll circle round to these questions, and you'll go deeper and deeper into layers as you get deeper into your book. So I guess what I'm saying there is, don't feel like it's got to be perfectly formed at this point, but you should have a fair idea of the argument that you're making with your book, that there's a lesson here, there's a wisdom, there's a truth that I've learned through this journey that I'm going to be sharing in my memoir, because that's what you have to offer the reader. So how do we get to your argument? I want you to take 5 to 10 minutes to just journal on these questions. What is this really about? So what is this story about? What is your argument, or the point that you're making, the lesson you wish to share? So it might be that X is the key to Y, that giving up alcohol is easier than you think, that walking can heal so many things in your life if it was the salt path, that eating locally can profoundly shift the way you experience life, that it's totally possible to drop out of society and live an alternate lifestyle. Any of those things could be the argument that you're making. Or what is the question your story will answer? So how do I carry this thing? How do I do this physical challenge that I never thought I would be capable of doing? So somebody who set themselves a big challenge, climbing Everest or whatever, might choose to write about that. How did I do it? So take 5 to 10 minutes to just pause this video and journal whatever comes up in your answers to these questions. So it's going to be really important in the following exercises we do around putting boundaries around your book. Okay. A few more points on memoir before we finish. I've heard it said many times from many sources, write from your scars and not your wounds. This quote, I have seen it attributed to Glennon Doyle, but I'm pretty certain I've seen Glennon say that it wasn't her that said it first. So I'm going to drop her name there. Maybe Glennon Doyle's, but it may also have come from another writer. It's certainly something that you'll see repeated often. And what this really means is that writing your story can be really emotional, especially if you've been through traumatic times or you've had difficult relationship challenges, or you're writing about something that might be contentious. It can be really emotional. It can bring up a lot of stuff. So you've got to take good care of yourself. Take breaks when you need to. It can be tempting at first, excuse me, to write as a kind of therapy, or to write to have your say, to take that, so that someone else who you feel has wronged you might get to read your perspective, or that you'll get to share your point of view. And I would caution you that if you're feeling like this, to really take some time to question your motivations and just get really clear on the purpose of writing this book. Because if your book is boastful, or it's vengeful, or it's having your say on something where you still have really raw pain, the reader is going to feel that. The book may well feel quite heavy, and they may not want to read it or finish. They might start it, they may not finish it. It may just feel like too much because it's too raw or too painful. And so it's really important to be able to process your own healing and then write from a place of perspective. And that allows you to make room for the reader to come into your story. It's not just about getting your revenge or having your say. It's actually about offering this wider truth to the reader. Sometimes that might mean you have to take a break, but understand that it's normal, and it's something that a lot of memoir writers have to work through and come to in their own time. And that can also mean that sometimes you need to write it, but you don't need to share it. So sometimes if you're writing about something that was painful or contentious or difficult, you can write the whole thing. You can have your say on everything, you can just get it all out on the page and then put it aside and come back to it later. Time can really be your friend here, because when you've done that act of putting it on the page, when you've written it all out, you might come back to it a week, a month, 6 months later, a year later, and find that actually you don't need to say it. That the act of writing it allowed you to process it, and then you're able to share with the reader with a bit more perspective, a bit more detachment, and maybe a bit more of a measured view, because there's always two sides to a story, right? And the older I get, I think the more I understand that what is truth really, we all remember the same events differently. And so sometimes if we write from that place that's too raw, or from a motivation that is about that sort of having your say, it can end up causing you, the author, more pain later on. So perspective is really your friend, and I encourage you to just take a breath, take a break, put things aside, come back to them, especially on painful topics, and don't be in a rush to put it in the world. Maybe that you decide to write it all or publish it all, but make sure you do that from a considered perspective with really clear motivations. All right, so on that heavy note, I will end there. Know that it's all okay, and I'm here to support you. And yeah, memoir can be really challenging to write, but it can also be so incredibly powerful, because as Cheryl Strayed said at the beginning, that you show us the truth of what it means to be human, and when you do, we say thank you. I see myself in you. All right, I'll see you in the next lesson. Bye-bye.